Picture this. You are walking through the bustling heart of ancient Rome, the Forum, around the year 67 AD. The air is alive with the noise of merchants hawking wares, senators gossiping beneath marble colonnades, soldiers marching in gleaming armor. Then, suddenly, the crowd parts. Conversations die down. People bow their heads, though some cannot resist lifting their eyes to witness a sight so bizarre, so unsettling, that it chills even the most hardened citizens. The emperor himself, Nero, master of 30 legions, ruler of the Mediterranean world, strolls proudly among them. But it is not his presence alone that steals the breath from the Forum. It is the figure beside him, adorned in silks that shimmer like water in sunlight, crowned with jewels imported from the edges of empire. A young bride, radiant and dignified. At first glance, a vision of Roman imperial beauty. But whispers ripple through the crowd, sharp as daggers, this is no woman. This is Sporus. He was once a boy. What you are seeing is not love, nor marriage, nor even politics. It is a grotesque theater, the emperor's private nightmare turned into public ritual. And behind the jewels and silks lies one of the most disturbing acts of psychological and physical violation in recorded history. Before we plunge deeper, consider the weight of what is unfolding. This is not just another tale of Roman decadence. It is the story of how absolute power can warp grief into madness, love into obsession, and a human being into a living doll, an object crafted to suit the broken heart of a tyrant who could not bear reality. The name Sporus may not be familiar to you. He is a shadow, almost forgotten by time, but once you hear his story, it will follow you long after this tale ends. For in Sporus we see the human cost of unchecked power, the haunting echo of lives crushed under the will of men who believed themselves gods. And so, to understand how Rome's most infamous emperor could descend to such darkness, we must start at the beginning, not with Sporus, but with Nero himself. Because the tragedy of Sporus cannot be separated from the tragedy of the man who enslaved him to memory. Nero was not born a monster. In his youth, he even offered Romans a glimpse of hope, a promise of golden days to come. But in the chambers of power, promises rot quickly, and even golden ages curdle into nightmares. By 65 AD, the mask was slipping. The emperor who once inspired hope had begun to unravel. Historians cannot pinpoint the precise moment when Nero crossed the line between eccentricity and madness, but the pressures of absolute rule, combined with his own insecurities, created a storm that few could weather. And like so many storms in Roman history, it would sweep away not only the emperor's enemies, but those he claimed to love most. It was during this time, when paranoia gnawed and power intoxicated, that Nero met the woman who would become the axis of his world, Poppaea Sabina. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known to history simply as Nero, was not destined, at least in the beginning, to be a tyrant. When he ascended the throne in 54 AD, he was just 16 years old, more a boy than a man, yet suddenly burdened with the rule of an empire that stretched from the windswept moors of Britannia to the deserts of Syria. For a people weary of court intrigue and suspicious of emperors who came before him, Nero's youth seemed like a chance for rebirth, a golden dawn. And in those first years, Rome allowed itself to believe. The young emperor reduced oppressive taxes that had weighed down the poor. He funded public spectacles, games, performances, festivals, that filled the streets with joy and gave citizens the intoxicating feeling that they were loved by their ruler. He walked among them as a performer himself, reciting poetry, singing with musicians, even acting upon the stage. To the common people, he seemed approachable, more human than the cold marble statues of emperors past. There was a kind of magic in those early days. Some historians record that when Nero first took the throne, crowds erupted with cries that a new, golden age had arrived. And for a brief moment, perhaps they were right. Rome had never been more powerful, its legions unbeaten, its coffers overflowing with the spoils of conquest. A young emperor who seemed to delight in entertaining the people was, at first, a refreshing novelty. But power, especially the kind that rests on no limits, corrodes even the most promising soul. Within the vast palaces of Rome, Nero's every whim was indulged. He lived in a world where no one could contradict him, where even a raised eyebrow might be interpreted as treason. Imagine being 16, catapulted into a life where millions obey your commands, where advisors flatter every utterance, and where the law bends like wax beneath your fingers. It is the kind of power that would test even the wisest of men, let alone a boy raised in the coils of palace intrigue. And yet, for a time, Nero managed to keep the mask of promise intact. He hosted games for the plebeians, sponsored new buildings for the capital, and cultivated an image as a lover of the arts. Foreign dignitaries saw him not only as a ruler but as a patron of culture, a man who could recite Homer as easily as he commanded armies. It was intoxicating, this marriage of political power and artistic flair. But beneath it all, cracks had already begun to form. The seeds of paranoia sprouted early. Even as he charmed the masses, Nero lived in fear of betrayal. Assassination plots were whispered through marble halls, daggers glimmered in shadows. To rule Rome was to rule with suspicion gnawing constantly at the heart. Who among his senators secretly dreamed of replacing him? Which general commanded too much loyalty from his soldiers? Who in his own household might one day slip poison into his cup? Still, in Poppaea, Nero found the one thing Octavia could never give him, a partner who understood his hunger for glory. She shared his visions of grandeur, encouraged his artistic pursuits, and played to his vanity like a virtuoso plucking the strings of a lyre. To Nero, she was everything Octavia was not, vivacious where Octavia was quiet, commanding where Octavia was meek, intoxicating where Octavia was sober. But what began as passion soon darkened into something more dangerous. Nero was not merely attracted to Poppaea. He was consumed by her. Theirs was not a love affair in the ordinary sense. It was the spark of obsession that would, in time, ignite a tragedy capable of burning even an emperor. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and in the flickering torchlight of Rome's imperial palaces she shone brighter than any jewel Nero could command. Ancient writers describe her as breathtakingly beautiful, a woman whose very presence shifted the balance of a room. But she was more than just a painted face. Poppaea was intelligent, calculating, and ambitious, possessing the kind of instinct that could either elevate a man to greatness, or destroy him utterly. When Nero first encountered her, he was already married to Claudia Octavia, the daughter of the late Emperor Claudius. Octavia had been the perfect political match, a union designed to strengthen Nero's legitimacy on the throne. But as a companion, she was cold and distant. Reserved by temperament, dutiful but not dazzling, she brought Nero neither passion nor inspiration. For the emperor, whose life was increasingly dominated by performance, music, and spectacle, Octavia was a shadow, a reminder of duty when he craved delight. Poppaea, by contrast, was fire incarnate. She reveled in attention, dressed to dazzle, and spoke with a wit sharp enough to cut through layers of courtly flattery. Where Octavia sought to fade into the background, Poppaea placed herself at the center of every gaze. In her, Nero found not merely a lover but a mirror for his own restless desire to be admired, adored, and feared. The affair began, as so many did in Rome, as whispered rumors, late-night visits, stolen moments behind curtains, coy glances across the banquet table. Adultery among the elite was hardly shocking. Roman aristocrats had long practiced a double standard when it came to fidelity. Husbands strayed openly, while wives were expected to guard their chastity like a fortress. But this was no ordinary dalliance. Nero was not an anonymous senator, he was emperor. His choices had the power to scandalize an empire. And scandal was exactly what followed. When the truth of Nero's affair leaked into public gossip, Rome buzzed with outrage and fascination. Ordinary citizens muttered disapproval in the crowded baths and taverns, while members of the Senate whispered darkly about the erosion of tradition. Yet there was also a sense of inevitability. In the imperial court, beauty was not merely admired, it was currency. And Poppaea Sabina knew how to spend it. Historians have debated her motives endlessly. Was she genuinely in love with Nero? Or was she a master strategist, using her allure to climb to the pinnacle of power? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between. She seemed to recognize that Nero's obsession with her gave her unprecedented influence. She could whisper in his ear, steer his affections, and through him shape the very course of the empire. But such influence was a perilous gift. For a woman in Rome, power was always borrowed, granted by a man, and withdrawn at his whim. Nero's fascination with Poppaea was not the gentle devotion of a husband, nor even the fiery lust of a lover. It was something darker, something corrosive. To the emperor, Poppaea was not a woman with her own desires and ambitions, she was a treasure, a prize, an extension of himself. And once Nero had claimed her, he could not tolerate the idea of sharing her with anyone, even in passing glances. Roman historians describe him flying into rages if other men so much as looked at her too long at public events. It was not jealousy in the ordinary sense, it was ownership. Poppaea was his possession, like a golden statue or a masterpiece painted by the gods. For a man who already lived in a world where reality bent to his will, his obsession with her became a kind of madness. He stationed guards around her at all hours, not merely to protect her, but to monitor her every word and movement. He lavished her with gifts so extravagant they strained even the imperial treasury, pearls from the Indian Ocean, silks from far-off China carried by caravans across the deserts, exotic perfumes from Arabia. Each gift was not only a declaration of love but also a chain, binding her ever closer to him. In Rome, extravagance was nothing new. Emperors before Nero had bathed in luxury, adorning themselves with riches won by conquest. But Nero's excess had a theatrical edge. He was not just showering Poppaea with wealth, he was trying to reshape reality, to create a world in which she existed solely for him. Every detail of her life became a performance directed by the emperor himself. And when reality did not fit his desires, Nero simply rewrote it. He divorced Octavia, casting aside the daughter of Claudius in a scandal that shocked the empire. Octavia, popular among the Roman people for her dignity and modesty, became a symbol of Nero's cruelty. Crowds demanded her return, staging protests in the streets. But Nero silenced those voices the only way he knew how, with blood. Octavia was exiled, then executed on charges of adultery, charges many knew were fabricated. Her death cleared the stage for Poppaea, but it also stained Nero's rule with a crime that even his supporters struggled to justify. When Nero finally married Poppaea, he did so with a spectacle so opulent it surpassed anything Rome had seen before. The wedding was a display of imperial power disguised as romance, with golden garlands, feasts that stretched for days, and musicians filling the air with song. To the Roman people, it was a reminder that their emperor lived in a different reality, one where love and politics were indistinguishable, and both were drowned in oceans of wealth. Nero's fascination with Poppaea was not the gentle devotion of a husband, nor even the fiery lust of a lover. It was something darker, something corrosive. To the emperor, Poppaea was not a woman with her own desires and ambitions, she was a treasure, a prize, an extension of himself. And once Nero had claimed her, he could not tolerate the idea of sharing her with anyone, even in passing glances. Roman historians describe him flying into rages if other men so much as looked at her too long at public events. It was not jealousy in the ordinary sense, it was ownership. Poppaea was his possession, like a golden statue or a masterpiece painted by the gods. For a man who already lived in a world where reality bent to his will, his obsession with her became a kind of madness. He stationed guards around her at all hours, not merely to protect her, but to monitor her every word and movement. He lavished her with gifts so extravagant they strained even the imperial treasury, pearls from the Indian Ocean, silks from far-off China carried by caravans across the deserts, exotic perfumes from Arabia. Each gift was not only a declaration of love but also a chain, binding her ever closer to him. In Rome, extravagance was nothing new. Emperors before Nero had bathed in luxury, adorning themselves with riches won by conquest. But Nero's excess had a theatrical edge. He was not just showering Poppaea with wealth, he was trying to reshape reality, to create a world in which she existed solely for him. Every detail of her life became a performance directed by the emperor himself. And when reality did not fit his desires, Nero simply rewrote it. He divorced Octavia, casting aside the daughter of Claudius in a scandal that shocked the empire. Octavia, popular among the Roman people for her dignity and modesty, became a symbol of Nero's cruelty. Crowds demanded her return, staging protests in the streets. But Nero silenced those voices the only way he knew how, with blood. Octavia was exiled, then executed on charges of adultery, charges many knew were fabricated. Her death cleared the stage for Poppaea, but it also stained Nero's rule with a crime that even his supporters struggled to justify. When Nero finally married Poppaea, he did so with a spectacle so opulent it surpassed anything Rome had seen before. The wedding was a display of imperial power disguised as romance, with golden garlands, feasts that stretched for days, and musicians filling the air with song. To the Roman people, it was a reminder that their emperor lived in a different reality, one where love and politics were indistinguishable, and both were drowned in oceans of wealth. The divorce of Octavia sent shockwaves through Rome, but the scandal was nothing compared to what followed. Nero, in a move that seemed both reckless and defiant, announced his intention to marry Poppaea Sabina, not as a mistress hidden in the shadows, but as his empress, crowned before the eyes of the empire. Roman weddings were not merely private unions, they were spectacles of legitimacy, rituals that bound families, gods, and politics together. For an emperor, they were acts of propaganda, performances meant to display Rome's strength through luxury and tradition. Nero's wedding to Poppaea was no exception. In fact, it was excess raised to the level of myth. The palace was draped in garlands of imported flowers. Incense from Arabia burned in braziers, filling the air with sweet smoke that clung to the marble halls. Senators and generals attended in flowing robes, their faces carefully schooled into masks of celebration even as whispers of disapproval crept through the ranks. Musicians played from balconies, while slaves poured endless streams of wine into golden cups. The feast alone lasted for days, a demonstration of wealth so staggering that Rome's treasury strained under the cost. For Nero, this was not just a wedding. It was a proclamation. He had rewritten the script of power, defied tradition, and enthroned the woman he adored. In that moment, he believed himself invincible. But Poppaea understood that the marriage was a double-edged sword. On the surface, it elevated her to a position no other woman in Rome could rival. She became Augusta, Empress of the Roman world, with her face stamped on coins and her name praised in public ceremonies. But power at Nero's side was as dangerous as it was intoxicating. Every smile she offered, every word she spoke, had to be calculated. One misstep could transform Nero's devotion into fury. Still, she used her influence shrewdly. Poppaea advocated for her allies, secured positions for her relatives, and quietly built a network of supporters who might protect her if fortune shifted. She maneuvered through the labyrinth of palace politics with a grace that left even her rivals grudgingly impressed. For all her beauty, it was her mind that kept her alive in a world where emperors were gods one day and corpses the next. And yet, there was a fatal flaw in her power: she was not afraid to speak her mind. Unlike the courtiers who bowed and flattered, Poppaea challenged Nero openly. She argued with him over policy. She criticized his endless artistic indulgences, mocking his poetry and performances when she thought them unworthy. It was a dangerous gamble, but perhaps she believed that her hold over him was strong enough to survive his temper. But passion, when mingled with pride and paranoia, is a fire that consumes everything in its path. And in the gilded halls of the Palatine, that fire was already burning, waiting for the spark that would bring tragedy to its full, terrible flame. For all its splendor, Nero and Poppaea's marriage was built on a fault line. Beneath the glitter of jewels and the perfume of roses, cracks spread silently through their union, cracks born of Nero's vanity and Poppaea's sharp tongue. Ancient historians tell us that their quarrels were frequent and bitter. Poppaea, accustomed to being adored, did not temper her words. She pressed Nero on matters of state, mocked his obsession with theater, and demanded more recognition for herself. Sometimes her sharp remarks amused him, other times they ignited his volcanic temper. The breaking point came in a moment both banal and catastrophic. Poppaea, pregnant with their child, had been urging Nero to return early from a public appearance. He resisted. She pressed harder, her words cutting through his excuses. Perhaps she spoke too plainly of his selfishness, or perhaps she compared him unfavorably to other rulers, a wound Nero's pride could not endure. What happened next is cloaked in both rumor and horror. Some say Nero, inflamed with rage, struck her violently in the abdomen. Others claim it was a kick in a fit of fury. Whatever the exact act, the result was the same: Poppaea collapsed, her body broken, the life within her extinguished. The palace was thrown into chaos. Servants scrambled to summon physicians, but it was too late. Poppaea Sabina, Empress of Rome, the woman who had captivated and commanded Nero, lay lifeless. With her died not only the child she carried but the dream of a dynasty Nero had once imagined. Even in grief, Nero was theatrical. He is said to have wept uncontrollably, not for long-lasting sorrow but for the spectacle of it. He ordered her embalmed with rare spices, encased in marble, and laid to rest with honors more lavish than any mortal woman had known. Rome mourned her death, though whispers spread quickly: the empress had not died of misfortune, but of her husband's hand. For Nero, the line between passion and destruction had finally vanished. His love for Poppaea had been absolute, yet so was his need to dominate. And when those forces collided, love became indistinguishable from violence. Her death marked a turning point in his reign. Where once Nero's cruelty had been tempered by charm, now it grew unchecked, fueled by paranoia and self-indulgence. The empire would soon feel the shadow of that fatal night, when an argument between husband and wife altered the fate of Rome itself.
Poppaea's death left Nero unmoved. For all his cruelty, she had been the one figure capable of commanding his attention, of shaping his moods with a glance or a word. Without her, the emperor who ruled the world seemed strangely hollow, his grief twisting into rituals both grotesque and pathetic. At first, he tried to smother Rome in mourning. Festivals were cancelled. Public ceremonies were draped in black. Senators were forced to pass decrees honoring Poppaea as if she were a goddess. Her funeral was staged as an imperial opera, with perfumes flooding the streets, ivory statues paraded through the forum, and choirs chanting her praises. But the grandeur only made the whispers louder. Rome was not mourning a saint, it was burying a victim. Nero himself wept openly, but his tears had the air of performance. He lingered at her tomb for hours, speaking to her as though she still lived. He ordered artists to craft countless portraits and statues of her, surrounding himself with her likeness so that she was never absent from his sight. Some claimed he refused to sleep alone, instead calling for young boys dressed in Poppaea silks to lie beside him, a grotesque pantomime of the wife he had destroyed. And then came the most chilling twist of all: Nero could not let go of Poppaea's image. He began to search for someone who could replace her, not in affection, but in form. He scoured the empire for a figure whose beauty might echo hers, until at last he found one, a boy named Sporus. But we will return to Sporus soon. For now, what matters is the state of the emperor himself. Alone in his palace, his world of marble and gold became a prison of memory. His grief was not the grief of a man who had lost his wife, but the grief of a child who had broken his favorite toy and could not forgive the silence that followed. Nero's reign, already stained with blood, now entered its most unhinged phase. His paranoia grew sharper, his cruelty more theatrical, his detachment from reality nearly complete. The death of Poppaea had not humbled him. It had hollowed him. And in that emptiness, he would soon commit one of the strangest and most disturbing acts ever recorded in Roman history, remaking the woman he lost by remaking another human being entirely. Grief alone did not satisfy Nero. He could not accept that Poppaea was gone forever. The emperor who believed he could command the world could not tolerate the finality of death. And so, in his twisted imagination, he began to seek a replacement, not a partner, but a replica. He found it in a youth named Sporus. Ancient historians describe him as delicate, beautiful, and strikingly feminine, with features that recalled Poppaea in her youth. To Nero, he was not a boy but a canvas upon which to recreate what had been lost. The emperor's solution was as brutal as it was surreal. He ordered Sporus to be castrated, erasing the marks of masculinity so that his body might be remade in Poppaea's image. Then, dressed in fine gowns, adorned with jewels, and painted with cosmetics, the youth was paraded before the court as though he were the resurrected empress herself. But Nero did not stop there. He staged a wedding. Rome's elite watched in disbelief as the emperor of the greatest empire on earth stood in solemn ceremony, placing a veil upon Sporus's head and vowing himself to this imitation of Poppaea. The marriage was celebrated with all the pomp of imperial ritual banquets, processions, music, yet it carried the weight of grotesque theater. What had once been the empire's most sacred social bond had been transformed into parody. To the Romans, this was scandal upon scandal. Some mocked Nero behind closed doors, others whispered that Sporus was not a youth at all, but Poppaea reborn by Nero's madness. Whatever they believed, none dared to oppose him. The empire had grown accustomed to cruelty, but this was something different, an emperor who treated reality itself as a stage, bending flesh and ritual to his grief and desire. And Sporus, young and powerless, became both prisoner and symbol. To Nero, he was Poppaea restored. To history, he became the most haunting reminder of what happens when absolute power is poisoned by obsession. The marriage to Sporus was not merely a scandal, it was a sign. To Rome, it revealed that Nero had crossed into a realm where grief, theater, and tyranny blurred into one. But if the emperor's private world was grotesque, his public rule soon became catastrophic. The empire itself seemed to mirror his instability. Fires erupted in the city, not just the Great Fire of 64 CE, but smaller blazes that kept Rome in constant fear. Whether Nero had ordered them or merely failed to control them, the rumor spread that the emperor himself enjoyed watching the city burn. Some swore they saw him on a rooftop, dressed in stage costume, singing of Troy's destruction as Rome itself collapsed in flames. The people, once tolerant of his excesses, began to turn. Taxes soared to fund his endless performances and palaces. The Domus Aurea, the golden house he built after the fire, was less a home than a monument to his vanity, vast gardens, mechanical dining rooms, and a colossal statue of himself rising like a god. To the starving, dispossessed citizens of Rome, it was a daily insult. Paranoia deepened his cruelty. Senators who opposed him were accused of treason and forced to commit suicide. Generals who grew too popular were recalled or executed. Even his closest advisors fell one by one, victims of his suspicion. In Nero's eyes, the empire was full of enemies lurking in shadows. And yet, he still demanded to be loved. He forced Rome's nobility to attend his poetry readings, sometimes lasting hours, where no one dared leave or even cough. He traveled to Greece to compete in games meant for athletes and singers, bribing judges to crown him with laurel wreaths. He demanded not the respect of an emperor but the adoration of an artist. But Rome was growing restless. The legions muttered on the frontiers. In Gaul, Spain, and Africa, governors whispered of rebellion. Even in Italy, citizens grumbled that the emperor cared more for his stage than his people. The shadow of betrayal lengthened with each passing month. What began with the death of Poppaea had become something larger, an empire unraveling under the weight of one man's obsession, grief, and vanity. Nero still believed himself untouchable, a god among mortals. But beyond the marble walls of the Palatine, Rome was preparing to prove him wrong. By the late 60s CE, the spell of Nero's rule had broken. His theaters, his games, his endless performances, once tolerated, even amusing, were now despised as insults. Rome needed a ruler, not a singer. And the empire, vast and restless, was no longer willing to endure him. The first cracks appeared far from Rome. In Spain, the governor Galba raised the standard of revolt. The legions, weary of Nero's neglect and hungry for real leadership, pledged their loyalty to Galba instead of their emperor. Soon, provinces across Gaul, Africa, and the East followed. Back in Rome, panic spread through the Senate. No longer fearing Nero, they sensed his weakness. When word reached the capital that the Praetorian Guard, his own bodyguards, had abandoned him for Galba's cause, the Senate declared Nero a public enemy. The once untouchable emperor was now an outlaw, stripped of his titles, hunted in his own city. Nero fled the palace in disguise, only a handful of loyal slaves by his side. He galloped through the night, trembling, muttering to himself. The man who had once commanded the greatest empire in the world now begged for refuge like a criminal. At last, he reached a villa on the outskirts of Rome. There, surrounded by only a few companions, Nero faced the truth: his reign was over. The Senate had condemned him to die in the ancient Roman fashion, stripped naked, tied to a stake, beaten to death. Terrified of such humiliation, he resolved to end his life before capture. But even in this final moment, the actor in him hesitated. Holding a dagger to his throat, his hand trembled. He begged his companions to show him how to die. "What an artist the world loses in me," he cried his last words, a farewell not to Rome, but to his imagined stage. Finally, with the help of a servant, Nero drove the blade into his neck. At age 30, the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors lay dead. His body was hurriedly buried in secret by a few loyal women, among them, Act, the concubine of his youth. Rome awoke to a new dawn, stunned but relieved. The tyrant was gone. The stage was empty. Yet his shadow lingered in memory, a boy emperor who might have ruled wisely, but who chose instead to live as a god, an artist, and finally, as the destroyer of all he loved.